start with the quarterbacks. Who are we starting?
I'm going to stick with Kyler Murray. I know he had a bad game last week, just 10 points, and it's going to be cold in Carolina this week, but I think he'll be fine. It's a good matchup. Their defense has given up 19-plus fantasy points to 3 of the last 4 quarterbacks they have faced, including Cooper Rush, who had 3 touchdowns against them last week in Carolina. So keep the faith, keep Kyler in your lineup, and Bake, as Lindsay likes to call him, he should be good to go. He had a massive game, which Lindsay kind of predicted last week against the Chargers. I did not love the matchup. I was wrong. He has now scored 18-plus in 3 of his last 4 games. He's got Mike Cowpokes this Sunday night since week 8. The Cowboys have allowed 13 total touchdowns and the most points to quarterbacks on a per-game basis.
I have a question, sir. And it's a start-sit question with regards to Kyler Murray.
Okay.
Jaden Daniels, I think the answer is pretty obvious, but I just want to double-check. Jaden Daniels against Philly.
Yep.
Or the aforementioned Kyler Murray in that matchup against Carolina.
Yeah, I'm sticking with the kid.
Me too.
I'm sticking with Daniels.
Okay. Yep. The projected points on Sleeper do not favor him. Weirdly. I don't know how Jaden Daniels doesn't have more projected points, but
gotta be close though.
I guess that's it. Yeah, it is. They're both in the 19 range, but I just thought that was kind of a weird algorithmic situation. Who are we sitting?
2 quarterbacks playing on Saturday. Remember, we've got a couple of Saturday games this week. First, CJ Stroud, who has been one of the biggest studs in fantasy this season. He's failed to score more than 16 points in 8 straight games, and now he's got the Chiefs. They have allowed the fewest points per game to quarterbacks in the last 4 weeks, so CJ Stroud needs to be on your bench. Same with Russell Wilson. With or without George Pickens, I don't think it really matters. He has failed to score 16 or more points in 4 of his last 5 games. The Ravens over the last 4 weeks have given up the 5th fewest points per game to quarterbacks. Russell needs to be on the bench.
What about our running backs? Who are we starting this week?
Stick with Chuba Hubbard. I know he had a bad game despite a good matchup against the Cowboys, but the Cowboys defense has actually been playing better. Arizona has been nails against quarterbacks, but running backs have actually done well against them. They've given up 4.7 yards per rush and the 5th most points per game to the position since week 8. So, I mean, unless this goes game script crazy and the Panthers are getting smoked like they did last week, I think Hubbard's going to get enough touches and score enough points to be pretty good. And then Jerome Ford, typically you don't pick up a player off the waiver wire and play him in a week 16 matchup when the semifinals are here, but Nick Chubb's on injured reserve. So keep that in mind. The Bengals have given up 15-plus points to 4 running backs since week 11, including 2, Najee Harris and Tajay Spears, who beat them for more than 24. So I think Jerome Ford is in that RB2 flex range this week.
Okay, RB2 flex. All right, interesting. Who are we sitting?
No, Saturday game, Isaiah Pacheco. You know I am not a big fan of Pacheco. I was not last week. I am not now. He is splitting carries and touches basically right down the middle, including snaps with Kareem Hunt. And the Texans have allowed the 3rd fewest points to running back since week 8. So Pacheco should be on your bench. This one here is more of a beware Brian Robinson Jr. We loved him last week, but his numbers weren't great. And he had a really good matchup against New Orleans. He was okay, but we expected a lot more. Now he's got Philadelphia. They've given up the 4th fewest points to running backs over the last 8 weeks. They're a very tough run defense. So keep that in mind that Robinson probably is going to be in the flex spot in a lot of leagues, but the matchup is not favorable.
Wide receivers. Let's talk about the guys that we like more than we maybe typically do.
So Brian Thomas went off last week, and I don't expect him to have nearly as good of a stat line. I mean, that was his career high. Had a couple of touchdowns. Mac Jones has tunnel vision to Brian Thomas Jr. The matchup, Lindsay, is actually not good. The Raiders are tough against perimeter receivers. It's so weird, but when you look at the stats, like they held Mike Evans, Jamar Chase to like really kind of modest or worse stat lines. But I'm sticking with Brian Thomas Jr. because of the target share and because, well, I mean, this is going to probably be a pretty ugly game, but Mac Jones loves peppering this rookie with targets. So I'm going to stick with Brian Thomas Jr. and I'm going to stick with Juwan Jennings. I know last week was bad. It was bad for almost everybody in that game on Thursday night against the Rams. The Dolphins have allowed 5 touchdowns to wide receivers in the last 4 weeks. They've also given up the 12th most points per game to the perimeter in that time. And so I expect the 49ers offense to bounce back a little bit in terms of what they do through the air, even though it's not Miami's defense is not awful against perimeter receivers for the entirety of the season, but they haven't been as good against them lately. So I'm going to stick with Juwan Jennings and expect a bounce back game from not only him, but Brock Bowers, especially when you have that running back situation where we're not exactly sure what we're going to get from Patrick Taylor.
Who are we sitting at wide receiver?
You probably got to play DK. I get it. I understand, but I just want to warn you guys. I mean, it's very strange for me to have one wide receiver from the same team as a start and another as a sit. But I mean, look at the numbers. Like DK has failed to score more than 10.6 points in his last 4 games, 6 or fewer targets in 3 of those games, and he's failed to produce regardless of really the strength of the opponent. And so even though this week's matchup against Minnesota is good on paper, I'd beware DK Metcalf this week. And then Calvin Ridley. Mason Rudolph's going to start. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I mean, I don't really think it matters. It's much ado about nothing. Ridley at 9 points last week, despite a good matchup against Cincinnati. He's failed to score more than 12.9 points in 4 of his last 5 games. The last time he played the Colts, he had 0.9 of a point. It's hard to play any Titans pass catchers. I know Okonkwo had a big game last week. Again, I don't care. I need somebody whose floor is not going to be as low as Calvin Ridley's potentially will be this weekend. Let's go to the tight end position where Sam Laporta has finally looked like the guy we all drafted as the number 1 tight end in fantasy football way back in the summer. Double digits in 3 straight games. In 4 of his last 5, he had 18 in a loss to the Bills. Most recently, the Bears have been very generous to tight ends. In fact, the 9th most points allowed to the position since week 8. And Laporta beat them for almost 16 points back in week 13. So you could play him. And then as long as he's good to go, and Doug Peterson had said that Brenton Strange will be good to go. 12 targets last week for Mac Jones. So he has plenty of faith in this kid. The Raiders have allowed the most points to tight ends in the last 8 weeks. I think Brenton Strange is a very nice sleeper in this one, especially if you need help at tight end, and a lot of people do.
Who are we not playing at tight end?
You mentioned Cade Otton. He's banged up, and he's got my beloveds this week. Now, the Cowboys do a lot of things wrong, but they've actually been tough on tight ends. They're giving up just 43 yards per game to the position. And also keep in mind, the targets have really gone down since Mike Evans has come back. Baker has thrown in Otton's directions 4 or fewer times in 3 of the last 4 games, so that's not good. And then
because he's throwing in Jalen McMillan's direction.
Well, there you go. Kyle Pitts. Hey, it's every week with Kyle Pitts, but you know what? When I'm right, I'm right. Kyle Pitts, even against the Raiders, couldn't have a good game.
No.
Now he's got the Giants. The Giants are giving up 45 receiving yards and 10.9 points per game to the tight end position. Kyle Pitts may end up going down in history as the biggest tight end bust in the history of the NFL because of where he was drafted.
Mm-hmm.
He is not even close to expectations being met. Maybe Michael Penix will change that. I don't know. I don't think so. But Kyle Pitts needs to be on your bench.